Hello, so today I am going to model for you how I might model the reading of a graph in a classroom. The graph I am going to be using comes from the Keepers of the Bay lab, which is part of the 7th grade curriculum typically used in the ecology unit. Okay, here we go. So, looking at this graph, so I know that a graph, all the information on the outside of the graph tells me about what I'm going to see in the actual data of the graph itself. So that's where I'm going to start. So I'm going to start here at the top with the title, the bay's decimated oyster population. So by the bay, I'm going to assume that we mean the Chesapeake Bay. Decimated, I know that the word decimated means just broken down, gone, away, huge, just a big change in a negative direction. And then oyster population. Okay, so I happen to know that oyster population is one of the ways that people measure the health of the Chesapeake Bay. So that makes sense. All right, so moving forward. I see there's a key here, and there are two parts to this key. The first one is Virginia landings, and that seems to be a gray color, and then Maryland landings, which is a darker color. Okay, I suspect that as I go on, that will become more clear of what those two things are trying to show me. So now I'm going to move to the axes. I'm going to start with the y-axis. So y-axis, landings. Oh, connection, landings. So landings in millions of pounds. I'm going to hypothesize here that what the y-axis is actually measuring is the millions of pounds of oysters harvested in Virginia and Maryland at the different landings where they actually measure these things. So then moving on to the x-axis, well, there's no title here. So I'm going to have to do some pretty serious inference to figure out what exactly they mean and what exactly they're measuring here on the x-axis. So I'm going to start down here on the left. 1,875, 1,880, 1,885. So we're definitely going up by fives as we go along. Oh, it's years. That's what it is. It's years. 1875, 1880, 1885. Got it. So we're looking at information about millions of pounds of the oyster population or oyster harvest from 1875 through 2000. Okay, and this is put out by the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. Now I know that they're a foundation that's really active in both measuring and improving the health of the Chesapeake Bay. All right, so now that I've done all the outside stuff, now I can start looking at the data itself. I'm just going to start here on the left and kind of get an idea of what is being measured with each of these bars. So this is 1880, and this would be a measurement of how many million pounds of oysters were harvested in 1880. So it looks like in Virginia, so the lighter bar here, about 118 million pounds. Wow, that's a lot. And in Maryland, we're looking at somewhere like 72-ish million pounds. That's still a lot. Okay, so that's what each bar is telling me, looking at the Maryland amount versus the Virginia amount. So I'm going to start, before I look at any trends, I'm going to look at these different events that are recorded, because I know that the only time you're going to include a particular event like this is if something of importance happened then. So the first one is the dredge introduced. And I know that there's a couple of things that dredge can mean. One is the digging up of the floor of the bay to make it deeper so that big ships can go through. I also recently learned that dredge is also a harvesting method, where instead of picking up individual oysters, the entire oyster bed is picked up and harvested at the same time. So I notice that, I just can't help but notice that when dredge was introduced, the overall population just plummeted. I wonder if that might have something to do with that picking up of the entire oyster bed at once. Moving on, I've got two others here. I've got Dermo found in the Chesapeake Bay and MSX found in the Chesapeake Bay. I don't know what Dermo and MSX are, so that's something I'm going to have to go look up. Based on the overall trend before and the overall trend during, honestly, those things don't seem to have had a huge impact on the overall population, although MSX does seem to have impacted the population somewhat more than Dermo did. The other thing here is the Bay's dead zone recorded. Now I know that a dead zone is a region within the bay or an area within the bay where the dissolved oxygen is so low that life literally can't exist. So it looks like early 80s or so that the first dead zone was recorded. And I see that there's a significant drop-off in population when the dead zones were recorded and then in continuing time of what actually is coming out of the bay in terms of the oyster population. So now I'm going to take a look at overall trends. Definitely can see why they use the word decimated here, because we're going from 118 million pounds in Virginia to maybe 2 or 3 observed here in the year 2000. So decimated makes sense. The other thing I noticed is that Virginia consistently harvests a lot more than Maryland does until you get down here when after the dead zones were recorded. And I wonder if that has to do with a change in regulations and in how much could be harvested and was allowed to be harvested in particular regions. The other thing I notice is that Maryland's population seems to have this curving wave pattern to it. And I know that natural populations tend to have an ebb and flow in their overall population, and this seems to fit that particular pattern. The Virginia numbers fit that pattern somewhat, but not as clearly as the Maryland does. I wonder what Maryland was doing differently than Virginia that allowed this natural ebb and flow of the population to continue, at least until the mid-80s when everything dropped off. Okay, I hope this was helpful to you as an example of how you might model reading a graph for your students in your classroom.